Hiya! So, welcome to my YouTube channel, Laura Learns Mora. I am Laura Chichak Roy, and I thought I would try something different for me. So far on my channel, I have done short videos that are about random facts. So I thought this time that maybe I would share some of my writing um, and see how that goes. But basically, I've written some novelettes and some stories, and I've written one novel, which you can purchase if you're interested through Amazon. So I'll put the description and information in at the bottom of the video. And I thought today that I would read from Samuel and I, which is the novel that I wrote. So it has 20 chapters, but I'm only going to read from the first one. So I've not done this before, so I apologize if as I'm going along, if I mess up the words or anything, or if you get bored of looking at me while I read it, you can go about doing whatever you want around your flat or apartment or whatever, and just leave me on in the background if you like. And sorry if you randomly hear the cat in the background. He is 20 years old and he makes this like noise where he's like, and just try to get your attention. But he's got his food, his water, and his tray is fine, so he's fine. So if you hear him in the background, that's what that is. So, chapter 1, and it's called Smitty and the Neighborhood. I've come too far to turn back now. For some reason, I thought it would be easy to watch one of the persons closest to me die. I didn't do anything to instigate it, but it didn't do anything to stop it either. Yes, I felt guilty, but to everyone else, I was the victim. There have been many times I thought about ending it. I'd become desensitized to the act of suicide over the years. I know for some people, they can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. They feel the only option is to end their pain. However, it seems to me to be a selfish act. I don't feel the need to sugarcoat it. Maybe I've become too cynical about it all. I know from personal experience that people most affected by it are the ones left behind. Of course, the people who attempt or succeed in committing suicide have their own reasons. Okay, they're gone and they no longer have to worry about their own lives, but they inadvertently shatter the lives of others, mainly the people who love them. So I guess I do have a sense of guilt. Not because I felt that it was my fault, but because I didn't feel anything. One of the people I loved the most and whose opinion meant the world to me decided to end it all when I was 14. Why this single act alone led me to spiral out of control, I'll never know. I will never know. Under the circumstances, it would have been very easy for me to turn to vandalism, drugs, or violence in the kind of neighborhood I grew up in. But it didn't turn out that way. I had an interesting childhood up until that point. My neighborhood could be ranked as one step up from sleeping on the streets. I felt love in my household. It was outside my home that caused me to have an almost selective introverted personality. I was born into a loving family, loving yet slightly screwed up. Denial was a great personal protector. I'd always known there was something different about me from my other siblings, but I chose not to see it. It would have been very easy for me to go from treading water to sinking in it. Instead, I chose to look at my surroundings and blend in. I was poor and everyone around me was as well, but even in poverty, there are degrees of separation. However, for the most part, everyone I grew up with had a similar upbringing. It's really quite strange. It's been 20 years since I thought about the summer when I met Samuel. But it is as clear and fresh in my mind today as it was then. As though nothing has changed. As if I haven't changed. But I know people have moved on. Well, the world has moved on. Everyone has got themselves into a frenzy. If things were to have happened differently, I might have found it easier to sleep at night. Some kids had it really hard. My friend Samuel's life was especially a miserable one. I guess you have to appreciate his upbringing, or the lack thereof. While most kids played on the street corners or hung out in arcades or laundromats, he was in a homemade prison. I met Samuel the day he moved in. It was a few streets away in a nice area of town. We got to be so close. I brought him into my inner circle of friends. His mom used to let him play with the kids in the neighborhood all the time. However, one night, everything changed. His mother changed. That summer seemed to take such a long time to get going. All the kids on my block were so excited. When that third week in June approached every year, kids around the neighborhood rejoiced. Summer break had begun. No more cocky 20-something teachers yelling at you for petty things such as chewing gum or passing notes in class. There was no dreaded detention either. Well, the humiliation of writing the same sentences 200 times on the chalkboard. Teachers were so lame, as if they would remember these moments and we thought they'd be life-changing. The strange thing about summer break was we always found ourselves hanging around the school when it was closed. I suppose we thought we were being dangerous. There was no one guarding the school for those 3 months. As children, we thought that it was like breaking the law to climb the padlock fence and get into the playground. There was a bright map of America painted on the ground at the back of the school. I know now we only got one state right, and that was the one that we lived in. I was as carefree as a child as I want to be as an adult. Had no curfew, and as long as I didn't get into any major trouble, my parents weren't strict. Safety in the neighborhood was not great, but we'd walk around in small groups. It was an unspoken rule not to go out and play without at least one other person. Crime and drugs tend to go hand in hand amidst poverty. When you need money for the roof over your head or food for your kids, you have to take drastic measures. We didn't go to bed without having any food, but we have gone to bed feeling hungry. With the exception of money, I think Samuel and I were birds of a feather. He was born to privilege, yet he was lonely. I was born to poverty, but had loads of friends. I think we related to each other in the sense that we were the extremes of our situations. Actually, I was always the poorest of my friends. They assumed I wouldn't be able to buy the coolest new toy at Christmas or afford to go on school trips. There were times we had to provide $5 to go for a school trip for the gas to take us on the field trip. Often the kids were right. I didn't have the money, but they were constantly trying to make me feel inferior. Samuel was different. He didn't care about my status. He wasn't trying to impress me or rub my nose in his wealth. He just wanted to be my friend. His mother came from money, and when she married his father, she had to choose love over money. They lived just outside my neighborhood in the good part of town. Samuel still had to attend my school by law because in those days it wasn't common for people to get homeschooled. Samuel's father made a good living as an accountant. Samuel didn't want for anything. Not that he would. When his parents first met, they apparently fell deeply in love. I could never imagine how that could be the case, considering how frigid she seemed. According to Samuel's father, she wasn't always a nice queen. To be honest, my memories of her are quite vague. It wasn't until later that everything changed. I prefer to reminisce about the happy times in my childhood that, oddly enough, don't include her, such as my 9th birthday. It was the summer of '91. That was an amazing time, a whole decade before America second-guessed itself in every security situation. As a child, I had never felt the threat of an overseas bad guy. I suppose I was lucky to be born as the last of the fearless generation of children. I don't think parents today are trying to scare their kids. However, I do think that children now are far more exposed to the dangers of society. I suppose I was more bubble wrapped. I did some pretty stupid things as a child. I put myself in questionable situations, but when I was a kid, there was no internet, no predators, well, not that anybody knew about, and no unknown danger to worry about. It seems absurd to say all this now, as I am only approaching my 30s. My friends are always saying so much has changed for their own children. It's hard to believe that so little time has elapsed for this to happen. I feel really old now. Damn grown-ups and their eventual truths. They always said, you'll see things differently when you're older and you have kids. When do you think it is that we lose the ability to ignore the judgments and opinions thrust upon us by others? When I was younger, unless you were a relation or my friend, I couldn't care less about what you thought about me. There's so many things I miss about being a kid. I have a vivid memory of playing in the rain. I ran down the street chasing Samuel with no shoes on while pretending that I was treading along the sand of a golden tropical beach. I'd never been to a beach or seen one as a child, but that didn't matter. When I ran out of breath, I would stop and stand in the stream of water that was heading for the sewer grate. I made sure I stayed clear of the actual sewer. I could sense that there could be glass floating by the filter, but it didn't occur to me that the water I was standing in itself probably had glass and many other things that could be dangerous, such as used drug needles. I never really thought about the world around me as being dangerous, with the exception of that one time when a grown man in broad daylight robbed my friend Samuel and I thought it was pretty safe. We were walking to the library to borrow books for a school project when it happened. As you can imagine, we did not go to the library very often because it was in the center of, like, drug central in our neighborhood. Of course, we lived in a big city, but it was the only library within walking distance, and we didn't have the money to just get on a bus and go to town. So we thought of just walking fast, not making eye contact with anyone, and we would be okay. Sammy was not used to having to conceal any property he had in his possession in the same way that I was. Where I come from, people can act like magpies. If you're wearing an expensive ring and you walk in an unfamiliar area, you should either take the ring off or try not to draw attention to yourself by turning the ring around. If someone sees you wearing a plain band, they're less likely to attack you for it because they'll assume it's cheap. Samuel came out of the house only to play with me and never took him anywhere that was unsafe. So as we were walking, he pulled out a Walkman out of his hooded jacket pocket and he asked me if I wanted to listen to it, and I freaked out and I shoved it into my coat. I whispered to Samuel, "Pretend nothing happened and just keep walking." The next thing I know, I had a throbbing pain coming from my left ear, and as I went to hold my ear, a guy appeared before us and stopped us from walking past him. I looked down at his hand, and he was holding a butterfly knife. Samuel and I were silent. The man said, "Give me your Walkman. I see it and I want it. If you don't give it to me by choice, I'll take it by force, and a couple of your teeth with it." I handed over the Walkman and I looked down at the ground so he wouldn't think I was trying to be brave. As I stared at the pavement, I saw some blood come down and initially thought it was my own earlobe bleeding, because I could feel the pain in my ear. I could feel that he had sliced it, but it wasn't my blood dripping. It was Samuel bleeding. The man punched Samuel in the mouth and split his lip, and the guy ran off. Samuel was stunned. I was stunned. I felt so bad for Samuel. He had to explain to his mother what had happened, but he didn't say he was robbed. He said some kid accidentally hit him thinking he was someone else. I can still picture the look on his face as we stood there bleeding together. It's strange how minds retain selective memories throughout our lives. I have vague recollections of my grandfather and how he looked. It's sketchy at best. But by the same token, I can picture the house my grandparents lived in so well that I could practically walk around in it in my mind. My grandfather had a strong, calm reserve about him. I might have tested his boundaries, but I would never cross the line with him. He was raised in a very different manner to me. He had a very strict upbringing. Although he could be stern when he needed to be, he was fair. I think it is a testament to his generation. Nowadays, people have to reason with their children every time they ought to be punished in order for them to listen. Of course, it depends on the individuals and how they decide to discipline their children, but sometimes I can't help but wonder if kids are given too much leeway. The days of unspoken fear instilled in you by grown-ups are long gone. My grandfather never laid a finger on me, but the idea that if I did something wrong, he could punish me kept me out of a lot of trouble, which otherwise I could have easily gotten into around my neighborhood. So I owe him a lot. Although he had a strong influence on my life, he was not the only man I respected growing up. Aside from my father, there is another man that springs to mind, Mr. Smitty. He was such a quiet man and a settled soul. He wore a checkered lumberjack shirt and black faded slacks. Every day, he had the same outfit. His wardrobe must have consisted of 3 or 4 sets of the same, because if you asked anyone, they would have said all of his clothes looked exactly alike. He had a certain powerful silence about him. He was often mistaken for being weak. I suppose his age played a pivotal role in that assumption. I reckon he was about 70. Every day he would walk up and down the street, hour after hour. It was almost as if he had a personal force field around him. It didn't matter that people were taunting him behind his back. He didn't flinch when kids threw tiny pebbles of dirt at him. He wouldn't think twice about walking between people exchanging money and drugs on the street corners. Personally, I think if you had any sense, you would avoid that kind of situation. However, that was not the case with Smitty. He was so relaxed in his demeanor that over the years, people stopped calling him Mr. Smitty and opted to just say Smitty. Smitty seemed to feel that people were not aware of his presence. I don't think it was so much that people weren't aware of him, it's rather they didn't care. Often people would call him horrible names and accuse him of being xenophobic, but he didn't yell obscenities. There were only a handful of families in the neighborhood who were not a minority. In my neighborhood, the minority was the majority. Smitty and his wife bought their home a half a century ago. The world changed around them, and they just watched the calendar bring a new year and a new set of neighbors and a new society. Smitty had a daughter, and when she was old enough to move out, she moved on. She didn't keep in contact with them very much. Eventually, she had a daughter of her own, Smitty's granddaughter Jessica, and she would come to visit him every summer. None of the kids who lived in the street had actually seen her in person because she didn't come out and play with us. She would stay inside with her grandparents all day and all night. They would buy her gifts as a thank you for spending time with them. They couldn't afford much, but every other evening Smitty would walk to the local shop and buy her an ice cream. Jessica was afraid to walk on the streets during the day, let alone at night, so she never went with him. Smitty was a brave soul. In the evening, there was a group of kids our parents called future beggars who'd come out of their houses after having spent the afternoon pawning stolen items and smoking cannabis. They'd cluster in small groups around the block and taunt passerby. Sometimes they'd say some petty, cruel things to unsuspecting tourists who accidentally stumbled upon our block. There were times that they would circle around people and push them in a threatening manner. Personally, I would never go outside after dark unless it was to go to the hospital or if there was an absolute emergency. Every time Smitty came out, the kids would try again and again to get a rise out of him. He just deflected everything they said to him, which to most of the group wasn't particularly an issue because it was just routine. However, there were 2 kids in the group, Sean and Jack, who really seemed to get annoyed when they had no effect on Smitty. One chilly summer night in July, Smitty returned home with a cracked egg running down the back of his shirt and a deep gash on his forehead. Apparently, the 2 kids from the Future Bakers group, Sean and Jack, had thrown rocks and eggs at him, and he had made his way to the shop for ice cream anyway. They must have been really taunting Smitty because I heard he snapped and punched Sean in the stomach, then he punched Jack in the chest and just kept on walking. He was nearly home when Sean ran up from behind and hit him on the head with a handheld radio. Smitty was temporarily disoriented. He fell to the ground for a moment, but got back up and continued on walking. The police were called. It was a case of one person's word against another, Sean and Jack's word against Smitty. In the end, Smitty was given a warning and told to keep a distance between him and the kids. Of course, the whole idea of separation was ridiculous. I don't think the cops had thought it through. Once Sean and Jack realized they weren't in any danger as long as they didn't get caught in the act, they just increased their verbal assaults whenever they saw Smitty walking down the street. Things came to a head one afternoon when Sean and Jack convinced their girlfriends, who were part of the Future Bakers group, to take things a little too far. One day after a whole summer of staying indoors, Smitty's granddaughter finally went for a walk with him to the park. It was around lunchtime. The future bakers went out early that day. The kids spotted Smitty and his granddaughter as they were returning home just a few streets away. They ran over to them and formed a blockade. Smitty took his granddaughter's hand and tried to move around the kids, and they resisted and eventually circled around Smitty's granddaughter. Two of the girls in the group started pushing and pulling the granddaughter's hair. Smitty tried to move the kids away. He told his granddaughter Jessica to run home. He helped her off the ground, and she ran as fast as she could. She made it home safely. Smitty didn't. The kids took turns pushing, punching, kicking, and hurting Smitty. Thankfully, a group of tourists walking down the street happened to see the incident and came to Smitty's rescue. After the beating, Smitty was never the same, not just emotionally but physically as well. He had lost the power to hear in his left ear. A short time after the event, Smitty locked himself away. That was the last summer his granddaughter stayed over. Less than a year later, Smitty's wife died. He was left alone in a big house in a bad neighborhood. About 3 years after the beating, Smitty's health declined rapidly, and he came down with pneumonia and was in the hospital for 6 weeks. During that time, someone broke into his home and robbed him, then set it on fire. The fire department was able to save the property, but it was badly damaged. He refused to move out. Even though it was borderline being certified as condemned, when he returned home from the hospital, his house was a shell of what it once was. Sadly, Smitty lived the remainder of his life alone and isolated from the world. You could see his shadow behind the curtains in the living room. During Halloween nights, he would turn the lights off and sit in the dark for hours. His life was so lonely at the end. When he died, no one was with him. As a brisk winter approached that year, a rare sighting happened. Smitty's daughter came to visit him. However, she had come only to talk to him about selling the house. When she opened the front door to the house, it felt colder inside than out. In a corner of the living room, she discovered Smitty slumped in his chair. He had died in his sleep from a valve blockage in his heart. He was so sad. Where could he have gone for comfort? His daughter didn't care about him. His wife had died. His granddaughter Jessica had abandoned him. Smitty had such a sad ending to an otherwise humble life. Even though people weren't always nice to Smitty in his life, they did respect him in death. My parents thought it was important that my friends and I attend his funeral. There was a surprising turnout of people from the neighborhood at Smitty's wake. He was a decent guy and everyone knew it. Although the official cause of death was valve blockage, I honestly believe that Smitty really died from a broken heart. It's a bit depressing how families can grow apart in time. Smitty was trusting and forgiving man, yet he had no true family bonds except his wife. On the other hand, you can have a family and still strive to feel loved. There were some kids in the neighborhood that didn't get enough attention at home, so they would lash out thinking that they would fulfill this need of love. There were some adults in the neighborhood that had the same longing for a connection, but instead put up a front. They were not sure how to show affection to their kids. Instead of spending time with their kids, they'd let them come home when they wanted, and within reason, the kids could do what they pleased. You can tell those parents were because they'd nod their head at you during holidays as some form of acknowledgement, but otherwise there was no contact. At the other end of the spectrum, there were some adults who would make you feel uncomfortable. For example, there was a guy who lived 2 streets away from the kids. There was a guy who lived 2 streets away, and he was kind of creepy. Sometimes at school, we would have to raise money for a field trip, and we would try to sell chocolates door to door, and he'd always bought the most from kids. That wasn't the strange thing. What was strange is that he would always try to coax kids into coming into his house to watch television and have junk food and offer them the chance to sleep over. And he wasn't married, and he never had kids of his own. I don't think we ever knew him to have a girlfriend or a friend or any kind of bond for that matter. He was weird. Even though we had such a strange guy living a few streets away, it never sunk into my head that some adults could be dangerous or worse, dangerous predators. I guess that's something I had to learn on my own, unfortunately. I led a double life. That was the last summer Samuel was able to play out in the streets with the other kids and me. No one knew that Samuel and I remained friends secretly. I like to think that his whole life wasn't heartbreaking, and there was a significant feeling of love towards him at some point by his mother, and that she wasn't always tragic. But I fail to recall any memory that he had of her that hadn't scarred him. Except maybe the night his father left, she cried. He had never seen such emotion from her before or after that moment. I think she had tried to release something from within, but his father had had enough. It was too late. He just left. Although he had never he although he never left his son, Samuel loved him, and I think Samuel would have gone with him that night had he not been in the hospital. Samuel was ill as a young child. He had meningococcal meningitis. He was in the hospital for 2 months. He didn't know his father had left until he returned home. No one was able to have contact with Samuel for the first month because he was in the intensive care unit. I didn't see him until 3 months after his illness. By then, you might think he would have been jaded or guarded, but no, I think he didn't want to be anything like his mother. I think the feeling of captivity can be viewed in many ways. Samuel was never able to leave his house because his mother was so strict, although she claimed to be protecting him. When you're protecting someone, you don't hurt them intentionally. I had a few friends at school that had a similar situation of imposed claustrophobia like Samuel. There was a particular neighborhood in our area that was so dangerous that even the cops wouldn't cross the border of safety to come and rescue you. It was called Homewood. That's the end of that chapter. So as I'm reading this, I realize just how long the chapters are, and also how much I stumble as I read. So yeah, if you are interested to hear more of the story, you can comment below. Let me know what you think thus far. Maybe I can read another chapter or attempt to read another chapter. And also, like I say, in the description, I'll put a wee link if you want to